Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. This is Heather Creven from WasteCap, Nebraska, and we are going to go ahead and get started. WasteCap, Nebraska has some exciting news that we would like to share with you. Tomorrow, we will be merging with the Nebraska State Recycling Association. The new entity will be called the Nebraska Recycling Council. Nebraska Recycling Council's mission is to maximize the economic and environmental benefits of resource recovery in Nebraska. We are very excited about the two organizations becoming one and being a one-stop recycling resource for our members and constituents in the entire state of Nebraska. In this webinar, you will learn about becoming a Nebraska Certified Electronics Recycler. We will answer all of your questions, including what it means to be a Certified Electronics Recycler, the electronics recycling standards, the value of being certified, and the process and costs associated with becoming certified. You will also learn about a new grant program for Nebraska-based electronics recyclers to assist with becoming certified. Lynn Rubenstein has been the Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council for more than 18 years. She has been actively engaged in electronics recycling issues for more than 20 years, including operating municipal electronics recycling programs, writing the first guidance documents for setting up and operating municipal electronics recycling programs, founding and managing the State Electronics Challenge, and co-founding the Electronics Recycling Coordination Clearinghouse. She is a founding member and continuing board member of the Sustainable Electronics Recycling International, which is responsible for the R2 Electronics Recycling Standard. She is also a member of the Technical Advisory Committee that is responsible for maintaining and updating the standard. In addition, she is part of the team managing the Vermont State Standard Plan for Electronics Recycling, including delivering training to the operators of the collection sites around the state. Ms. Rubenstein has a Bachelor's of Arts in Earth Sciences from Wesleyan University and a Juris Doctorate from Southwestern University School of Law. During this webinar, please type your questions in the chat box as they come to mind, and they will be answered either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. A recording of this presentation will be available following the webinar on our new website, www.nrcne.org, that is being launched tomorrow. You will find it under the Resources tab and the Webinars page. Thank you again for attending this webinar, and as I turn the presentation over to Ms. Rubenstein, there will be a slight delay before she begins.
Well, hello, Heather, can you hear me? Let's start with that.
I can hear you.
You can. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Heather. And I am really pleased to be right on the eve of this exciting announcement for your new council, and we'll look forward to working with you. So this is wonderful. And I am so grateful for this opportunity to speak with people today. As Heather said, there's the chance for you to type in questions, and I really, really hope that you will do that. As appropriate, she'll interrupt me or we'll get to them at the end. I find, and I bet you have as well, that asking questions is the best way to be sure that you find the webinar not only enjoyable, but worthwhile. So as Heather indicated, these are just a high-level overview, what we're going to talk about, the context, the background, why am I talking to you, what I hope that you'll take away from the webinar, what it means to be a certified electronics recycler, why I think you want to be one, the process and costs associated with becoming certified, and of course, a grant opportunity announcement. So what is the background? There are around 15 electronics recyclers in Nebraska, and none of them are currently certified. Now, there is one that is in the process of becoming certified, which is very exciting, and you have in the past have had a certified recycler in the state. But as of today, there aren't any. And this webinar is part of the beginning of an initiative to try to build capacity in Nebraska for electronics recycling, seeing that there are more electronics recyclers that become certified. Why? Northeast Recycling Council, I am not in Nebraska, you figured that one out. My organization, NERC, has received a grant from the Consumer Technology Association, which is the trade association for manufacturers of consumer electronics. and it is very concerned about the quality of electronics processing around the country and around the world. And they became interested in Nebraska, realizing that there weren't certified recyclers there, and thought there might be an opportunity to really do some good and support capacity building. So that's the background and the context. So there's going to be 3 quick polls that Heather will run. These are, all 3 are actually intended for electronics recyclers. So I know that some of you are not, so I'd ask you to, withhold your fingers. But for anybody who's an electronics recycler, if you could go ahead and answer the poll. The reason that we're asking this question is because it will give me, as I speak to you, a sense of the maturity and experience of the recyclers on the phone. So I'll have some idea of whether you've already confronted the issues that are embedded in certification, or whether this information is really going to be right from the scratch. So that's what's going on. So Heather, did you run the poll?
And it looks like we still have a few more coming in
okay.
with the answer.
Okay, that's great.
Go ahead and close the poll.
Okay.
And share it. So we have, for the question, how long has your facility been operating in Nebraska? We have 0% at less than a year. We have 20% at 2 to 5 years. And we have 50% at 6 to 10 years.
Oh, that's very interesting. Huh. Okay, great. And thank you, everybody, for that information. So that tells me that there actually is a great depth of experience within the electronics recycling community. And so maybe you guys really are poised to become certified. So that's very exciting for me anyway. So what am I hoping that we'll be able to address and that you'll take away from the webinar? That you will actually understand what it means to be a certified electronics recycler. That phrase can be quite nebulous. Why it's a value to you, that you can have an appreciation for the overall process and costs that would become involved with becoming certified, and very importantly, answering your questions. You may have noticed that there are 5 documents available for download as part of the web interface. You have a little dashboard up on the right. It may be a little orange box, but you have that. And these are the 5. They're PDFs. Feel free to download them. If you don't download them during the webinar, but you realize later on, why didn't I? We can certainly get them to you. It's not a problem. So there's 2, and I will reference these documents as we come to them within the content of the webinar. 2 about e-Stewards, 2 about R2, and 1 the grant description. So with that, I'm going to really start into the what does it mean to be a certified electronics recycler. So one becomes a certified electronics recycler when a facility, so they're facility-based certifications, has been audited by a qualified third-party organization, and they're called certification bodies. So third-party means it's not you. These people don't work for you. You hire them, but they're outside experts who have come in, have looked at your paperwork, and have done on-site audits to verify that the way you operate are meeting the requirements of an internationally recognized electronics recycling standard. So in the United States, that is R2 and e-Stewards. So just another quick poll. Have you ever considered becoming certified? And again, this is just for the recyclers, please. And the reason I'm asking this is because I want to, again, this will help inform how I speak to you, whether you've already delved into a lot of these issues, whether you already have an idea of just what it's going to take, or whether most of this information is going to be brand new. And if you say yes and you haven't become certified, that's going to be interesting, because then clearly you'll have encountered something that made you concerned, that it might not have been right for you, maybe at that moment or ever, but that's helpful for me to know. And I guess your fellow listeners would find that interesting as well. So Heather, I'll wait till you let me know that we're ready to hear the results of that.
I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in, and I am sharing it now. And we have 89% that said yes, and 11% that said no.
That is interesting. Oh, that's juicy. Okay, that makes me want to, then say, okay, why not? But we'll get there. Great, thank you. So let's see, are you turning it back to me now?
Yes.
I think you have to do something.
It is on you.
It is? Well, what do you know? Okay. It doesn't seem to think that's so. My computer doesn't think that's the case. Resume slideshow. Okay, great. So as I said, in the United States, there are two standards. Now, you've probably heard them referred to as e-Stewards and R2, and those aren't actually their names. It's fine to call them that, but here is their full name. E-Stewards, Standard for Responsible Recycling and Reuse of Electronic Equipment, and of course, we call that e-Stewards. The other, the Responsible Recycling Standard for Electronics Recyclers, we call R2. You will sometimes encounter something called R2 RIOS, and that is when the RIOS standard is coupled with R2, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. I just want to, while we're on this slide, bring up that both standards are in the process of revision. And so I don't think that they're going to be radically different, but we're seeing changes in them. And e-Stewards, the Basel Action Network, which is the organization that houses the e-Stewards, they have publicized that they expect the release of their new revised standard in the fall of 2017. And R2 is looking a little further down the line. We're looking at next year. Should go out for public comment in January for the R2 standard. So customers, somebody who sends you electronics, they should want to use a certified recycler. And these are the reasons why. When a customer works with a certified recycler, they know what the best management practices are that the recycler is fulfilling. They can understand and have an appreciation for the various ways the recycler has engaged in best management practices. They can have a high degree of confidence in data destruction and in legal compliance by the company. They can be sure that what you're doing meets their expectations. You may have had the experience of hearing about another recycler where a customer said, well, gee, I didn't realize they were doing that. So that can, sort of bite you in not good ways. You want your customer to feel good about what you're doing. And it's the only way to ensure, again, I'm speaking as a customer, that a recycler is not self-certifying or making unsubstantiated claims. So it's very common for recyclers, and perhaps some of you do this, to say on their websites, I meet all of the e-Stewards standards or the R2 standards, or I have all of my federal permits and requirements. Well, first of all, there are no federal permits for the operation of a electronics recycling facility. And if you are meeting all of the requirements of a standard, then you should be certified. Saying that you are is not something that a potential customer can really hang their hat on. They need to know that you are meeting all of these standards and criteria, not just that a recycler is announcing that they are meeting them. So what are the benefits to you? Of course, that's incredibly important of being certified. Because there are currently no certified electronics recyclers in Nebraska, it will most definitely set your company apart. You'll have brand recognition, more visibility as a result of it. You'll be able to demonstrate that you meet the highest standards. You're likely to get more business. As you may know, the U.S. federal government, which is a very large purchaser of electronics and recycler of electronics, requires the use of a certified electronics recycler for their materials. And about a quarter of the Fortune 100 companies either express a preference for certified recyclers or require certification. So being certified opens up a class of potential customers that are not available to you when you're not certified. It also does really great things for your operations. It helps you establish procedures that lead to more successful customer visits, inspections, and regulatory inspections. Very important. An OSHA, state, or federal inspector comes in, you can have a high degree of confidence that those visits are going to go very well, because part of the requirements for becoming certified address those sorts of issues right on the head. So you can really have a high degree of confidence. Also, studies have indicated that recyclers that are certified find that they have truly improved operational controls, greater efficiencies, better idea of what's going on. They're able to produce a higher quality commodity. It really has great benefits for the operations of the organization. You're likely to see a decrease in injuries of employees. That's always good, which of course translates to lost time and lost money. And many certified recyclers have in fact seen decreased insurance premiums. So you can anticipate potential cost savings in addition to potentially new customer bases. Each of the standards has many, many categories of requirements. It's basically 11 categories in each. The standards in many ways are extremely similar. Their punchlines are the same. The way they go about articulating the requirements are somewhat different, and that's important to take into consideration when you consider which standard you might be interested in. I'm mostly going to be touching on each of these, on the things they have in common, and in a few instances where I think they're really substantively important distinctions, I will point those out. But what I'm hoping to do is just to give a high-level perspective on what's involved in these various requirements. And these are requirements that are in common. Again, they're not the only requirements, but they're ones that have in common. Now, going back to those downloads that we had, there's one for e-Stewards that is a summary of the standard, and then for R2, there's a guidance document. And R2, the guidance document, would walk you through all of the various requirements, and the e-Stewards summary takes a different angle on it, but same thing. You'll get a good flavor by looking at those of the overall requirements. But neither of those are the standards themselves, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Environmental health and safety management systems and implementation. This is really fundamentally at the heart of both standards. This is absolutely the core. Both standards are requiring that if you want to be certified to them, that you are certified to an environmental standard. And in particular, that is ISO 14001 for e-Stewards, or ISO 14001 for R2 or RIOS, which is another environmental health and safety standard. R2, in terms of health and safety, requires that you are also certified to either OSAS 18001 or that you are certified to RIOS, because RIOS does both environmental and health and safety. Stands for Recycling Industry Operational System, and it's a standard that embraces both. So both standards are requiring that you have this additional third-party certification to become certified to them. It can be done as part of your audit to these standards, but it is a requirement. And why? Why are they doing this? The more we learn about environmental health and safety in the workplace, electronics recyclers, the greater concerns that emerge. We're learning more and more about the potential risks and health hazards that the processing of electronics can introduce into a workplace. And so, of course, we want to be very concerned about the health and safety of your workers, as well as the potential for releases from the environment. And these ISO 14001 and RIOS do a really great job of articulating very specifically what you need to be thinking about. How do you design a system? Who within your organization is going to be responsible for implementation? How are you going to ensure implementation? They both include a continual review and improvement requirements. They're really, really important. And this is one of those things that if you are not currently certified, and if this might be, depending on what you've already been doing, and you may already have these certifications, this can be the biggest lift for a recycler to become certified. This is the area that most traditionally the standards find that recyclers that want to become certified, this is their weak link, and they are likely to need to be doing the most work to come up to par for this. So these environmental health and safety management systems include things like worker training including how to do their job safely, what the hazards are associated with their job and how to avoid them. It includes noise abatement, respiratory controls, gloves, avoiding getting shocks, those sorts of things. It talks about personal protective gear. It includes dust and particulate control, good housekeeping, very important. It'll talk about stormwater and wastewater. So it really looks at the whole experiential impact of your recycling process. And it's very, very important. And it's a huge issue, a huge topic, and a lot of criteria and steps are involved in that. And this is one that probably shouldn't come to a surprise to anybody. The standards require legal compliance. And the legal compliance goes all the way down to the local level. So where your building is, any local law. So for example, zoning. So legal compliance is zoning all the way through international law. And so that would be all US federal laws that pertain to worker health and safety, environmental releases, those sorts of water pollution and air pollution laws that can be state as well as local and federal. It pertains to international export laws, transboundary laws, and import laws. So for example, you're in Nebraska and you take in a CRT and you ship that whole CRT to Mexico. That was export. The company that you send it to in Mexico decides it's going to ship the CRT either whole or in parts to India. The container that is shipping in happens to stop in the Philippines to be put on a new ship. The Philippines are transboundary. India is importing. Every one of those countries is going to have laws about what it's legal to come into and leave their territories. So the legal compliance includes looking at that as well. And this, quite candidly, can be very tricky. Knowing in full the export laws, so the export law will be the United States, Mexico, and the Philippines in the example that I gave. The import laws are Philippines and India. So you have to capture all of these. Now, this is an area of real distinction between the standards. The R2 standard says you have to be, just what this says here, in full compliance with all laws that relate to you, whatever the topic. It's not just specific to you are touching electronics. It's any sort of law that would impact your facility, like stormwater management. That's why I have that example there. e-Stewards goes a little further and says that not only do you have to be in full compliance with local, state, federal, exporting, transboundary, importing laws, but you also have to be in compliance with the Basel Treaty. And the Basel Treaty is an international treaty that, among other things, talks about the movement of hazardous materials and hazardous waste between certain countries. The United States is not a signatory to that treaty, but e-Stewards holds companies that are certified within the United States to that requirement. Just a little FYI, we are in great company. The only other country in the world that has not ratified that treaty is Afghanistan. So that's quite a compliment to us. This is another area of great concern to both standards. And this is the hardest thing for me to describe. So I'm going to admit right up front that I'm going to be doing a very broad brush description and explanation of this. And certainly you can ask questions or we can confer more afterwards. But both standards have rigorous requirements that relate to the handling and processing of certain particular materials. R2 calls them focus materials. And it's a fairly clear list. Focus materials are CRTs, any types of batteries, circuit boards with some minor exceptions, but circuit boards, mercury-containing devices, PCBs, and while they're not focus materials, toner cartridges basically are treated like focus materials. e-Stewards has a much broader definition of the types and categories of materials that trigger special attention. And they include the phrase problematic materials, as well as hazardous materials and hazardous waste. The problematic materials, you can see batteries, that's similar to the R2, inks and toners, that's similar to R2. But e-Stewards has a much broader perspective on the types of materials that are required to have special consideration in the facility, in the processing, in the movement of the materials. And essentially, and this is where I'm really oversimplifying because it's very complicated, any device or component that has materials in it that are hazardous materials by the definition of the United States or of the receiving, transboundary, or export country, or hazardous waste in any of those categories, or is captured as a hazardous material or waste by the Basel Treaty, all of those are required to have these special handling requirements. So this is one of the areas where e-Stewards is really significantly different. It opens up a much broader category of materials that you need to be paying specialized attention to. In both instances, I just want to make clear that whether it's a problematic material or hazardous material under e-Stewards or a focus material under R2, it's two different moments. You get a cell phone, that's a focus material or a hazardous material because it has circuit boards, it has batteries, it has those two things. So it's a hazardous material. Excuse me, it's a focus material or a hazardous material, even when it's whole, because it has these components when they're taken apart. The battery is a focus material, the circuit board is a focus material or a hazardous material. So it's not just once they're separated, it's when they're intact as well that trigger these special requirements. Something else about e-Stewards that is very different from R2 is the bottom bullet under e-Stewards, the plastics with halogenated materials, shorthand, brominated flame retardants. It's not the only type of plastics they're concerned with. They're looking at the whole halogenated class of plastics. So as you know, a lot of consumer electronics have halogenated plastics. And so they are requiring special handling and treatment for those materials in a way that R2 does not. So that's a really substantive difference between the way the standards look at those materials. Critically important for both standards is that none of the things on the previous slide, hazardous materials or focus materials or problematic materials, cannot be incinerated, whether it's waste to energy or any other sort of burning, or land disposal. That includes hazardous waste disposal, no land disposal. There is an expectation that what you take in is going to be sent for reuse, and I'll talk in a moment about the criteria for reuse, or that they're going to be recycled. Now there's an exception. PCBs, those have to be managed as hazardous waste. They're not recycled. And every once in a while, you'll encounter a hazardous waste where the law of the country is requiring that it be managed as a hazardous waste. But absent that, the expectation is that if the product or the component is suitable for reuse, it'll be reused. And if not, it'll be recycled. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, CRTs, CRTs, CRTs. As you know, the management and recycling of CRTs has become a very hot button topic in the last couple of years. And both standards have been under a lot of pressure to not limit CRTs to reuse or recycling. There's a facility that you're probably familiar with in Illinois that has a retrievable storage capacity, which is a dedicated cell for CRT class that's been processed and basically in cullet form, and then it's landfilled into a dedicated cell for potential future retrieval. In some instances, it can be used as an alternate daily cover. Neither standard accepts that as recycling. So it's not allowed, if you're a certified recycler, it's not allowed as a way to manage CRTs by either standard, except e-Stewards is prepared to consider exemptions on a time-limited case-by-case basis. And it's my understanding that at least as a starting point to qualify for that exception, you have to demonstrate that the cost of recycling would be at least twice as much as the cost of disposal. So it's an internal deliberation for them. I'm not trying to say that that's the full breadth of it, but that's what they've publicized as a criteria that would begin the process for them to consider a case-by-case exception. But essentially, both standards are saying no to alternative daily cover and to retrievable storage as recycling. So not acceptable. Heather, are there any questions? I sort of thought that one might trigger a real reaction before I go on.
At this time, we do not have any questions.
Okay, that's fine. Well, we'll just see if that.
Everyone, yeah, that they can go ahead and put their questions in the chat box.
It's true, and you can yell at me in question boxes too. So testing for reuse. Both standards require that before a device or a component is reused, that it has to be tested and proven that it qualifies for reuse. Now, those criteria are how you test is a little bit different in each of them, and but essentially they both have you looking for, do the key functions work? A very simplified example of that would be you take in a cell phone and you'd like to sell that cell phone for reuse. It's a lot more money than taking it apart. You have to test it to determine if it works as a phone. Well, if it's a smartphone, it has to work as a phone. Don't care if the camera works. The key function is the phone. So you could sell it for reuse as a phone, but would have to disclose that the camera didn't work. The inverse, if I sent you my laptop and you thought, oh goody, I'm going to sell that rather than recycle it, and you test it and my camera works, but the circuitry doesn't work, that's not suitable for reuse because the key function, being a laptop, did not work. So you have to test, and there has to be a warranty that guarantees that the device or the component will work. There has to be a return policy that includes free return to the recycler that's selling. And all of this is because of a great deal of concern about the sham movement of materials. Some of the horror stories that you've seen on television and other locations refer specifically to this. Unscrupulous people filling a container full of stuff that in no way should be reused in the back, putting a couple of layers up front of good-looking material and shipping it. And the reason for that is that the export, transboundary, and import laws for reuse are much lower in threshold than for the movement of commodities or recyclables. So it's a way to backdoor your way around these requirements. And everybody's extremely concerned about that. So that's why we want to be sure that what's going for reuse actually should be reused. There's also a requirement that before something is reused, that any data have been destroyed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. Another absolutely core criteria of essential importance, and this too can be extremely hard for a recycler to fulfill, is downstream due diligence. So as a certified recycler, you're responsible to ensure that every downstream vendor, all the way until the final use of the material as a commodity, or preparation of it as a commodity, meets the same rigorous standards and criteria that you're being held to for environmental health and safety, and also for data management and for testing for reuse, for legal compliance, all the same. And so this, because much of this material will be moving overseas after it leaves you or the first tier vendor down from you, becomes trickier and trickier to track. And so both standards are aware of this. This is one of the things that both standards are looking at in the part of the revisions about how to have more solid information around this. So many of you know when I say downstream vendor what I mean, but just to give a very simplified example, let's talk about that same CRT that came into a recycler in Nebraska. You take the plastic housing off of it and you ship that plastic housing to a plastics recycler. So that plastics recycler is a downstream vendor, and they're probably going to be shredding it and grinding it, and that's probably the end of the downstream vendors for that plastic. But that CRT, let's say you ship it whole without the plastic case, but the rest of it you're just shipping to somebody else. Well, that's downstream vendor number 1 for that CRT. Now that company, they take off the yolk, the copper yolk, and that's it. And they then ship it to somebody else. So now you've got downstream vendor number 1 for the CRT itself, the yolk guy. Then you have downstream vendor number 2, which is where the whole CRT without the plastic, without the copper yolk went. And that company simply removes the panel glass. And then they ship the CRT without the panel glass to somebody else. Well, now you have another downstream vendor for panel glass, and you need to track what they do with the panel glass. They're going to have a downstream vendor from there. That CRT is still moving along. You're going to have another downstream vendor there. If they are shipping it to somebody else, you're going to have another downstream vendor there. Until that becomes cleaned cullet, you're going to keep having downstream vendors. So you, need to be tracking this all the way through to the end and having documentation about it. And as I say, this can be hard to do, but it's very important so that we're sure that there isn't the use of the informal recycling sector, that we're sure that laws are being followed and that worker health and safety and environmental considerations are fully being addressed. Data security, something not every person who sends along a computer for recycling pays any attention to, but they should be, as you know. So both standards require that the recycler, certified recycler, ensure the physical security of the data until it is sanitized. So you don't necessarily have to do the data sanitization yourself, but you have to ensure that that device is literally under lock and key. It's in a cage, it's in a secured area, it's secured movement until data sanitization happens. And data sanitization is not reformatting. It's either physical destruction or wiping that meets the requirements of the NIST or the NAID, which are special certification criteria associated with data destruction. So there are very high standards articulated about what has to be done to ensure data sanitization. And this applies to things that are going to be reused as well. So if you're going to be sending a desktop or a cell phone or a laptop or a copier or a printer for reuse or for recycling, that data has to be sanitized, and you have to be able to prove that that has happened. Many certified electronics recyclers go another step and get the data sanitization certification, the NAID and AID. It's not a requirement, and not everybody does it, but it's something that you definitely see. Tracking. Both standards want to be sure that you know what comes in to your facilities and how much goes out. And that's to be sure, it's sort of in some ways, it goes back to the due diligence requirements, the tracking. How do you know what's happened to your materials? We want to be sure that you know their fate. e-Stewards requires a mass balance, so that means that you have a weight of what comes in and you have a weight of what goes out all the way down through the downstream vendors, all the way down through that due diligence chain. You have to be maintaining weights, and it has to not literally be 1-to-1, but pretty close to it. R2 accepts a mass balance, doesn't require that, but does require documentation of material flow all the way inbound and outbound, same thing, all the way down the whole stream. And this is to be sure, again, that the materials are being handled in a proper way, and as a certified recycler, you understand what's happening to the materials and are taking responsibility for it. And finally, on the topic of what the standards require, are closure plans and financial assurances. Both standards require that you have liability as well as pollution insurance, and both require that you have a closure plan with adequate financial assurances and the control of a third party. So a closure plan, just in case you're not all familiar with that, is a worst case scenario. It's kind of a doomsday document. You've done a risk assessment of your facility and you've figured out all the things that could go horribly wrong. There could be a fire. you could walk away. You could go bankrupt and walk away. Nobody thinks you're going to do that, but we're looking at the worst case scenarios. What could go wrong that would require the site to be cleaned up? So the plan spells out the risks, and those risks are unique to your facility, the type of materials you handle, the volumes that you expect to handle, type of equipment that you are using, and then a cost for cleanup associated with each of those risks is determined, and you are required to have a financial assurance in the control of a third party. That can be a bond or letter of credit, for example, adequate to deal with if something goes wrong. So some of the, again, news stories that we've all been seeing recently about some of the abandoned CRT stockpiles. For those facilities that were R2 or e-Stewards certified, I mean, we're embarrassed. Nobody wants that to have happened. But on the other hand, there's a closure plan. So there is, in theory, money available for the cleanup in the control of somebody other than the recycler. Often this is a banker. So somebody totally outside the system, when this is tripped, can bring in those financial resources and oversee the implementation of the closure plan. Some states require this for facilities operating in their state, but most states don't have this. So this is something that many facilities may not have already, and so this would be something that would be new for you to do if that's the case as you went through the certification process. So this is the last poll, and the question is, if you are to be interested in becoming certified, do you know which standard you'd be interested in? And the reason I'm asking that at this particular moment is because I'm about to go into the steps for getting certified and the costs, et cetera, and those costs are different for the different standards. And so you might just want to have that in the back of your mind as we look at these. It's not to say that you have to have an opinion about this, but it will just be interesting for all the rest of us to know, but also as you think about the next set of information that's coming along, it might be a little bit more useful for you simply to have, had that thought in mind.
So Lynn, while we're waiting for the poll to finish, we do have a question. The question is, what is the recommended process for recycling CRTs at this time?
Well, the person who asked that can type in a clarification if I'm totally misunderstanding this. So I'm understanding that question to mean, what are the markets that are available other than alternate daily cover and a retrievable storage? So what are the markets? What on earth am I as a recycler supposed to do with this stuff? And the alternatives that are out there right now are primarily the ones that are being used are ceramic tiles. And that's, there's a company in Spain that takes processed CRT glass. It already has to have been cleaned and put into like the cullet form, that takes them. And there's a similar facility in Wisconsin that has not opened just yet, but is anticipated to within the year. And so the CRT, the leaded glass, goes into the glazes. And the US EPA has determined that that's acceptable when the stuff comes back in the United States. It's not going to need to be managed as a hazardous waste or hazardous material, that it's there's such small amounts in it and it's vitrified and held into the matrix that's fine. There are still lead smelters, only one in the United States, but there are lead smelters. They use the CRT glass, so the leaded glass as flux. In theory, this could also be the case for a copper smelter as well. Basically, flux is something that a smelter, industrial facility that melts, that creates raw metal. It's melting it down, and you're getting like the pure lead, pure copper, whatever. In order to keep those furnaces burning at the right consistent temperature all the time, they need silica, and of course, glass is silica. And they use CRT glass. They can use CRT glass to maintain those temperatures. Now, for a lead smelter, they will not only be using it as for silica, but they'll actually be reclaiming the lead. And there still is a lead industry. There still are uses for lead. So that is an outlet. There are, I think there's one in the United States. There are lead smelters in Canada and in other countries as well. Copper smelters is something that's being considered. It's a little less confidence building because it's not clear that the lead would get recycled in the end from that. So the lead smelter, that's a good outlet, as are the ceramic tile opportunities. There are also applications in sort of industrial applications where it gets put into really teeny weeny little small pieces and it becomes abrasives. Also, some of the reflecting paint on highways has little teeny bits of glass in it. In some states, it can be used as part of a blend for in asphalt. Panel glass, which, you know, I highly recommend you get the panel glass off these days because that has markets and outlets, and it just decreases the volume and weight of the leaded glass that you're trying to handle. So those are the primary end markets these days. They're not cheap. It's not like having these end markets suddenly means the stuff has become cheap. It is very expensive to manage. That has not been resolved. So if I didn't answer the person's question, I would ask them to tell us that. And I can take another stab at it. So Heather, what did we, yeah.
I have the poll results. So we have 40% that are interested in R2, and then 10% in e-Stewards, and 50% with no opinion.
Okay, great. That's very interesting. Thank you. And thanks for everybody for doing those polls. I do appreciate that. Okay, resume slideshow. Here we go. All righty. So getting certified. What are the key steps? This doesn't matter which standard you're looking at. A gap analysis. Assessing your operations and documentation against the standard. The standard. So that's where I said earlier, it's sort of helpful if you have one in mind. You don't have to have one in mind, but it, you know, makes it easier to figure out which one you're assessing yourself against. Now, some people hire a consultant to do this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But there are professionals that will come in and do that gap assessment and will then help coach you through any necessary changes that might be you would need to qualify for certification. Select a certification program. So in some ways, this probably should have been the first bullet. Because if you're interested in e-Stewards, you have to buy the standard to read it. So you have available as the download that summary document, but it's not the full standard. It's a really good sense of what the standard is, but it's not the full standard. And so if you're interested in e-Stewards, and we'll have a slide in a few seconds about the cost for that, you have to actually purchase the standard. It's a one-time cost in order to really learn all the minutiae. R2 is available for free download. The documents that you have, the checklist is something that you could use to do this gap analysis. It goes through the different standard requirements. You can say, oh, I need to do this, or I did do this. The guidance document tells you how you might need to be going about it. The e-Stewards summary document can also be used as sort of a checklist against their standard, but it's not the complete standard. Then you need to secure licenses. Those are annual. I'll talk about those in a second. You pick a certification body. I'll talk more about that in a few moments. And then you are audited by a certification body, and that includes 2 on-site audits as well as a documentation review. And depending on what happens with that audit, there might in fact be more site visits because it's possible to go through the first audit and for that certification body say, oh, you're not quite ready yet. You need to make this change first. And so depending on what that change is and whatnot, it might in fact trigger another visit, but usually not. It's a hypothetical possibility. So then everything goes fabulously, and the certification is literally issued by the certification body. So the CB sends you a piece of paper that says you are certified. And as I said, if you're not already certified to ISO 14001 or to RIOS, that process can be included as part of the certification to one of these standards. It does not have to be done separately. Each certification has annual maintenance requirements. So the way this works is, year one, the big year, you get certified. And then in each of the next 2 years, there's a so-called surveillance audit. So it's by the certification body, it's also on site, it's also paperwork, but it's not as comprehensive as year one. So that in year 4, you start back over again. It's the big year again. Both standards have licensing requirements, legal documents that the recycler enters into, and you have to have entered into these agreements before you can become certified or even audited for certification, and each of those have fees. I will talk about all of those, so we can get into that a little bit more. So what are the overall costs? And again, I'll give numbers, but these are the major categories. Consultant, you don't have to hire a consultant, but if you do, there's the cost of a consultant. If you need to do any operational improvements, for example, you discover that your training program isn't really what it needs to be, so you might need to develop and implement a training program, or if you discover that your air filtration system isn't really up to snuff, that would be something that would be an operational improvement. That's an as needed. You may not need any of this stuff. It could be perfect. If you are going to be R2 certified, you have to purchase the ISO 14001 and OHAS 18001 or RIOS. If you're going to be e-Stewards certified, you have to purchase the e-Stewards standard as well as the ISO 14001 standard. There are the annual licensing fees and the cost of the audits, both the biggie and the subsequent surveillance audits. So a consultant. These are experts in the electronics recycling standards and recycling industry. They understand how electronics recycling facilities work. And they are able to come in, they look at both your paperwork and on-site visits to assess your current operations and documentation against the standard that you're interested in becoming certified to. Again, you can do this yourself. This is not to say you have to have a consultant. You could do this yourself, but they know this stuff inside out. They know the standards inside out, and they can make recommendations to you about what sort of changes you might need and how to do those changes. So they actually provide technical assistance to help you get to certification. It includes at least one on-site visit, depending on the circumstances. It can be more, it could be 2 on-site visits. The cost range from the size of your facility, whether you already have ISO 14001 certification, for example, where they are relative to where you are, because it includes the cost of travel. So the ballpark range that I've been given is $15,500 to $20,000. That's for the consultant. But if you hire a consultant, and they say you're ready to be certified, then you are ready to be certified. You can have a good degree of confidence of that. Because as you will see, the certification process itself is expensive. You don't really want to be wasting that money to find out that you weren't ready. As I mentioned, if you need operational improvements, some examples, and these tend to be the ones that might actually be a little problematic money-wise, the development of an environmental health and safety management system plan, because it's a written plan, and the implementation of it. Developing and implementing a training program. You might need to improve your throughput tracking. You may have to put scales in places where you weren't previously using them. Improve downstream due diligence. That can be a real serious paperwork issue, and developing the staffing and systems for doing that. If you don't have a closure plan, getting a closure plan done and the financial assurances in place, those are costs as well. You may have all of this, and so who cares about any of this? You could just be in great shape. But for some companies, those facilities, those are relatively frequent things that one would find would need to be addressed. So buying the standards, these are one-time costs. e-Stewards, it's $195. ISO 14001, it's $162. So if you're doing e-Stewards, you have to buy both the 14001 and the e-Stewards. If you're doing R2, the standard itself is free, but you do have to pay for the ISO 14001 and OHAS 18001 or RIOS, which is a per facility annual membership. So that's different. The others, the first three are one time. RIOS is an annual cost. So what are these annual licensing fees and costs? So the Basel Action Network, I said, they own e-Stewards, and they have an annual licensing and marketing fee that's based on your revenues. One of the downloads, the handouts that was available for download, is their current sliding scale from their website. It was current of last June, but it is what's on their website right now. They also have a one-time initiation fee that too varies by the size of your company. So they have this upfront cost, but they also have this annual licensing and marketing fee. That's one fee. It's just what it's called. SERI, which owns R2, has an annual licensing fee, which is $1,500 per certified facility. It's $1,000 if it's a nonprofit facility. If you're doing R2 RIOS, if you're using the RIOS standard to meet your environmental health and safety management standard, then that's annual of $1,000 to $2,500 per facility. That's a function of the size of the facility and if you're a nonprofit or not. So you've signed your licensing agreements. That means you are authorized to enter into a contract with a certification body. They will not do that until you are entered into a license with either SERI or BAN. And you have to have purchased the standards as necessary. Then you hire a certification body. And their costs vary, embraces a number of factors. Among the most important ones are how many employees you have, whether you already have a certification in place for EHSMS. Each standard has a requirement for the minimum number of days on site. The auditor has to be there, so that affects cost. And as I said, with the consultant, depending on where they are and you are, there's travel for on-site audits. From the time that you sign a contract with an auditor, it probably will take 2 to 4 months for you to have received your certification. That's a function of, did they come in on an audit and say, gee, you're not quite ready, you need to address this or that. The cost of the audit for that first year is somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000. The annual surveillance audits are generally about a third of that cost. Each of the standards has certification bodies that are accredited to do the audits. So this means these certification bodies, in order to be allowed to do these audits, the auditors, the certification bodies, get qualified. They have to take tests, they have to take courses, they have to prove that they understand the standards, they understand recycling facilities, and that they are capable of going in and doing that full assessment, not only on site, but looking at the paperwork. e-Stewards has 4 accredited certification bodies right now. This list can grow over time. This is, as of today. R2 has those same 4 in addition to a few others. So these are the companies that if you were looking to hire a certification body, this is who your pool of potentials would be. So grant opportunity, yay. So there is a handout about the grant opportunity. And certainly if you're interested in this, you'll have my contact information in a moment. Really encourage you to be directly in touch with me. This is going to be a competitive grant program administered by NERC. We are prepared to give 2 grants of up to $25,000 each. The requirements are that it's an electronics recycling facility in Nebraska, that you do go through the consultation process with an expert who indicates that you are ready for successful audit, so that we know that once you go to that audit, you're going to get it, that you've obtained the necessary licenses in order to become audited, that you've secured 3 bids from qualified certification bodies, so somebody that was on that list for the standard, and that you've entered into a contract with the one who gives you the lowest bid. And it's important to get those 3 bids because the prices really can vary dramatically. So once you've done that, then you're eligible for the grant. I have not yet produced a grant application form or anything like that. Today, this is the first moment this is being announced. But we're ready to go. And so if you are interested in pursuing this, please feel free to let me know about it and we can talk about it some more. As I say, there is that download available. Here's my contact information. I am in the Eastern time zone. That's just an FYI, but it's not a big, it's not a big time zone difference for us. It's an hour. Here's my email address and my phone number. I certainly hope you'll be in touch. Follow-up questions, ideas that came to you, information about the grant opportunity, any of those things. I look forward to hearing from you. So Heather, I talked a long time. Are there more questions?
We do. We have an expansion on the other one. So they are looking for specific information on where to take CRTs. So
meaning who are those companies that, who are the downstream recycler, the downstream markets for recyclers? If that's the question, I can come up with a list.
Okay.
But those would be the first tier recyclers. So you have a CRT, what's the next step? So as I said, for example, if you decide you want to use the company in Spain, actually that's the second tier. The first thing you're going to have to do is to process that glass. You're going to have to get it, separate it from the panel glass, get it ground up. There are companies within the United States, if your company is not doing that, that can do that for you. And then the next step out would be the tile people. But I certainly can put together a list of companies.
And then we have another question. Someone is questioning whether Lifespan in Omaha is an R2 certified recycler.
As far as I can tell, they're not. Now, as I said, excuse me, as far as I can tell means that I looked last week on both the e-Stewards and R2 websites for certified recyclers in Nebraska. So I didn't look again this week, I have to admit. So that's the basis for my information. Certainly Lifespan is certified, has facilities certified in other states. They absolutely do. And it's also my understanding that they're pursuing e-Stewards certification for the one in Nebraska. That's from the e-Stewards website, not from a personal conversation. So if I could be wrong, but that's where I'm getting my information from.
Okay, Lynn, it looks like that's all the questions that we have. Oh, I lied.
Yeah.
Okay, that was just a comment that thanking you for the information, and they'll pass that along. Let's see.
And I'll work. Oh, sorry.
So I guess I have another question that says, is there an R2 light, something where you can ship anything that you collect to an R2 certified company, but you don't process yourself?
No, that's a very interesting question. No, there isn't. If you are only using R2 down, if you're moving all your material to an R2 certified facility or an e-Steward certified facility, it makes your due diligence much easier. There's no two ways about that. It doesn't eliminate the due diligence requirement, but it certainly streamlines it. The only light version, and don't take this literally, I mean, it isn't a light version, is that if your company literally doesn't do something, it's just like not part of your business plan at all, then there are opportunities to not be audited to that, which makes logical sense, but actually took several years for things to get to that point. So where this normally happens is brokers. Under the R2 standard, brokers can be certified. And these can be companies that never touch the stuff. They're arranging the movement of materials from you to a downstream vendor. And brokers can be certified in the R2 standard. Now, they may have no employees. Because they're never touching this stuff, there's things that aren't going to apply to them. They're not going to have to worry about worker health and safety issues or environmental releases because they're never touching this stuff. They do have to worry about it in terms of the people that they're moving the material to, but not for their own facility. e-Stewards does not issue certification for brokers. But that's it. That's the only exception. And it's fairly common in my experience for me to come across recycling companies who are a little taken aback. And I'm not speaking about Nebraska at the moment, I'm talking all over the country, who are taken aback to discover that because that they are not certified if they are using certified recyclers. In order to be certified, you have to have gone through the certification process for yourself. We have to be able to demonstrate that your facility, the way your facility operates, and the way, oh, here comes the train, your worker health and safety, and all of those sorts of issues, that your facility is meeting those same criteria. So I appreciate why that question would arise, but although it did not make it a short answer, the short answer would be no.
Well, Lynn, I think we have exceeded our time on the webinar.
Yes.
I would encourage everyone, if they have any questions, to either send Lynn an email or to give her a call.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time and the information.
Sure. Heather, let me just interrupt for 1 second, if I may. I will work on putting, I don't have this CRT vendor list together, but I will put it together in the next couple of weeks, and I know that I'll get the attendance list from Heather, and so I will both provide it to Heather, but also email it directly to everybody who was on the call, so you'll be getting that information in the next couple of weeks.
Sounds great, Lynn. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm delighted that so many people participated and look forward to working with you. Thanks for this opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.